evening, everybody. Good evening. My name is Dr. Toby Greene. I'm a Marie Curie Research Fellow in the School of Politics and International Relations here at Queen Mary University of London. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of Professor Tim Bale and Dr. Robert Saunders, who are the directors of the Mile-End Institute. And I also just want to say a very brief word of introduction about our event. So the Mile-End Institute exists to bring together politicians, policymakers, academics and the public to discuss issues of major importance to our country. And this evening we wanted to address a really very big question, the question of Britain's role in the world. And it seemed to us a big and important question right now because of the dramatic changes taking place around the world and also here at home in the UK. With respect to the changes in the world, we need only look at the NATO summit taking place over the last couple of days here in London, where you have a NATO summit at which the American president calls the Canadian Prime Minister two-faced and the French president nasty, and then officials brief after the event that, relatively speaking, they thought it went rather well, then we know that we're looking at a very different world than the one that we're used to seeing. Here at home in the UK, we're also seeing major political changes. We are more socially and ethnically diverse than ever before, and in many ways more polarised than we were before, and that relates to Brexit, but also to many other issues. So if once there was a broad consensus about Britain's role in the world, Britain in Europe in partnership with the United States, promoting a liberal, rules-based international order, today it's not so clear that any such consensus exists. So what are Britain's priorities today when it comes to issues like international aid, defence, trade, diplomacy, the environment, diplomatic relations, military intervention? So to discuss these issues, we have brought together a very diverse panel of individuals, each of whom has something distinctive to say on these questions. And we're interested to hear and explore the differences between them, but also perhaps find whether there are some areas of consensus also. We're particularly delighted to have Ritula Shah at BBC Radio 4 to chair our panel. And there'll also be, of course, an opportunity for your questions, and we encourage you to tweet using the hashtag MEIUK Global Role. And also to let you know, we have BBC Parliament filming here today for broadcast at a later date. So it only remains for me to thank our panellists and to thank our Executive Officer, Sophia Gaston, and our students who've helped pull this event together. And with that, Ritula, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toby. Welcome to the Mile-End Institute. I'm Ritula Shah, and I think we're really in store for a very interesting, stimulating discussion. And in the past, this question about Britain's national interest and the role this country can play in the world might have seemed a bit esoteric, a bit wonkish, my favourite kind of conversation. But this topic, these ideas have been given, I think, a new urgency among just ordinary people, not just because we're on the brink of Brexit, but because the very fact that we had the referendum has, in a sense, surfaced ideas, conversations about national identity, global status, global relationships, in a way that perhaps we've never had those conversations before. And what's more, whilst we've been talking amongst ourselves here in the UK, the world, as Toby was saying, has been changing around us very rapidly. And that world that we re-enter in whatever garb after January the 31st, if that date remains significant, is a very different one. And I'm going to leave it to the panellists to expound on these themes. But I do also want to refer back to that NATO conference over the early part of this week, because it was really interesting. There was a really clear illustration of how power and relationships are shifting. The communiqué yesterday spoke of unity and common purpose, as you'd expect, but it also mentioned China for the first time, which is in itself quite interesting. But I wonder whether what we learnt from that video that went viral was actually in some ways more significant. The one where Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, Justin Trudeau, and rather improbably Princess Anne appeared to be essentially having a laugh at Donald Trump's expense. It's a scenario that would have been unthinkable not that long ago. And is it just because it's Donald Trump? Well, perhaps. Or does it actually herald a more fundamental shift, which may turn out to be irreversible, one in which US influence is in irreversible decline, rapid decline? Has some kind of psychological barrier been breached? And if that's the case, what does it mean for that liberal world order that we've kind of taken for granted since the end of the Second World War? Who's in charge? I think that's one of the big questions that we can think about. Anyway, that's enough for me. Let's hear it from the panel. I'll introduce everybody. Sophia Gaston is Director of the British Foreign Policy Group. She's also a Research Fellow at the LSE and the author of Behind Global Britain, Public Opinion on the UK's Role in the World. Lord Howell of Guildford, David Howell, is a former Conservative Energy Secretary and Foreign Office Minister, a former Chair of the House of Lords International Relations Committee, and author of Look Where We're Going, Past Politics and Future Dangers. Sherelle Jacobs is the assistant comment editor and columnist at the Daily Telegraph, whose columns on geopolitics include "This chaotic global era will be a golden age for an independent Brexit Britain." And David Waring, Dr. David Waring, is a teaching fellow in international relations at Royal Holloway, University of London, and author of Anglo-Arabia, Why Gulf Wealth Matters to Britain. Welcome to you all. Toby gave us an idea of today's format. I'll just give you a bit more detail. We're going to hear 8 or 10 minutes from each of you answering that question. Is there a vision of Britain's national interest and role in the world that its diverse society can unite around? And if so, what is it? Then we'll have a bit of discussion among the panel, and of course we'll have questions from the floor. So let's begin. Sophia Gaston, if I can begin with you.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's great to be over in this part of town. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the public opinion side of this conversation about foreign policy, because of course foreign policy has long been the preserve of sort of the corridors of Whitehall, but some of that seems to be changing a little bit now, as mentioned, because we are in a time where we are compelled to do so. So I think it's important just to sort of step back and think about the changes in foreign policy, as well as so far as they reflect the changes more broadly taking place in our societies. And we certainly know that our society is becoming more polarized. And I think we're also moving into an era where citizens are demanding a more direct form of representation in their politics. And I think both of those things are presenting some challenges for our traditional conceptions of governance in liberal democracies. And in terms of foreign policy, I think really, with the exception of the Iraq War, probably, our foreign policy choices have really largely been made on the basis of a degree of public consensus about who our international enemies and our allies were, and also with quite a low degree of salience amongst the general population, certainly compared to other issues. So citizens generally happy to sort of cede control and judgment and decision-making power on these issues to their leaders. At the British Foreign Policy Group, we undertake research into public opinion on global affairs and foreign policy, and I think this is quite a new area of research, but one which will take on a greater degree of significance over the coming years. So I'm a social researcher, and I've been studying populism and all the destabilization that's been taking place in our liberal democracies since 2014. And I think this is something that's often undertaken as a comparative international exercise, but it's very much grounded in the domestic sphere. And I think what is entirely apparent now is that the dysfunction and upheaval taking place in national societies and national political environments are deeply consequential for the world order and directly impacting a number of critical spheres of international cooperation and governance and consensus. So I therefore do not think that it's possible anymore to consider foreign policy as simply a matter of the world at large. I think it's really about more than our external facing image. It's something deeply responsive to our domestic mood, our domestic functioning, our domestic temperament. And I think this is very important, of course, to Britain's very unique story and this very particular moment that we find ourselves in at the moment, trying to define and imagine our role in the world at a time when our society itself feels perhaps more divided and fractious than ever, and we're starting to actually pull at some of the fabric underlying our liberal democracy as well. So I'll just talk through some of the sort of interesting trends to note on around public opinion on foreign policy. And I think just considering some of the demographic distinctions here that we might not have traditionally explored. So what are the big factors that shape the way in which we see our international affairs, what we want from our international engagement, and even how we conceive of what is a domestic or an international issue? One of these factors is age. So if we look at young people versus older Britons, young people are around 10 to 12 percentage points less interested and knowledgeable about foreign affairs. It does affect the issues that you're interested in. Young people in Britain are much more concerned about global wars, humanitarian crises, and so on than their older counterparts. Young people also, interestingly, are more favourable to increasing our foreign policy budgets. They are less interested in multilateralism, so big multilateral organizations like NATO, for example, the alliance that's been in the spotlight this week. Only 44% of under 35s see it as important to our future national security. Only around a third of young people consider themselves to be patriots, compared to nearly 80% of over 65s. So I think age is a really important factor here. I think socioeconomic status, education levels, and where you live is also incredibly important. So 41% of those who say that they are uninterested in the UK's global affairs live in the same place where they were born, compared to just 20% of those who live more than 2 hours away from where they were born. So there's some interesting factors of mobility playing in. If you did not holiday at all abroad in 2018, you were 44% of those who did not holiday abroad see immigration as a very significant international issue for Britain, compared to just 6% who travel frequently. So there are really important factors that are shaping the way in which people see the world and Britain's role within that. And I think these are quite unexplored areas of research that we need to look into more. Something that is also becoming quite consequential is your political affiliation, and I think this is a very important development. So Conservatives, for example, we know are most supportive of multilateralism. In fact, the EU is the only one international institution and organization of which they do not support our continued membership of. UKIP and Brexit Party voters, there's some really interesting things going on there to consider if they do come home back to the Conservative Party, because they hold very distinctive foreign policy views compared to core Conservative voters. They are much more isolationist in their instincts, and they are much more likely to advocate for a reduction in foreign policy spending. Labour voters, well, they have some very distinct views as well. I've just published some research about their views around global threats. And actually, Labour voters consider the United States, second only to Russia, as the single greatest threat to global peace and security. Now, that is very distinct compared to, for example, Conservative voters. Of course, we can never get away from this Leave-Remain divide, and I think something interesting there is that 64% of Remain voters see themselves as global citizens, compared to just 27% of Leave voters. So I think all of this is very important, and particularly this role that political affiliations are playing in shaping identities and how we see the world, because I think our understanding of common enemies and allies has actually in the past been quite integral to the formation of national unity. So I think to come back to the question that we were posed around, is there a vision that could unite the country? Well, I've gone back through all my data sheets and tried to look for points of consensus around foreign policy, and it's quite difficult. There are a couple, basically around 2/3, and in some cases smaller majorities, support our membership of most of the multilateral institutions that we're already on board with. So I think there is a positive future for multilateralism in Britain. But around half of Britons want us to be a country that puts the welfare and interests of our people first. So wrangling those two and reconciling them will be interesting. Around half of Britons describe themselves as patriots. And I think quite positively, about 2/3 of Brits are interested in foreign affairs and our role in the world. So I think people want a proud Britain, a strong Britain, but one that's not really feeling so battered by the winds of global change. Achieving that will be quite a challenge, I'm sure. So I think what is true is that whomever wins the next election is likely to be presiding over a much more polarized and activated country. And I think foreign policy will necessarily become more contested within that landscape. And I think this will make the process of developing a vision for our role in the world more challenging, because it needs to find a way of balancing a much broader church of interests that are feeling much more empowered than they have been before, and they may be in competition with one another. And so I think the government's going to have to expend a much greater degree of energy on to try and exert and influence and shape public opinion on these matters than they have before. So as ever, I think the conclusion at the moment is difficult times ahead. Thank you.
Sophia, thank you very much. Lord Howell.
Right, thank you. I'm going to begin by doing something a bit unusual from folk where I come from, which is I'm going to answer the question, as the media interviewers keep demanding and not having much luck with politicians. The question, is there a vision of Britain's national interest and role in the world that its diverse society can unite around? Answer, yes, most emphatically there is. Unite around is a bit trickier because we're not a docile nation that tends to fall into single view on everything. There's always going to be argument, there's always going to be debate. We'll never get the sort of passive unity that some rulers long for in their people in this country, and there's always going to be very robust argumentation, and long may that last. But there is indeed a role, and before I come to the details of it, first, I think it is essential in order to be able to present what I'm going to say by a bit of diagnosis of the root causes of where we are. I mean, this is enormous doctor's practice, and we need to really analyse very carefully and deeply, not shallowly, what our internal problems are and our external position as well and how it's being affected, and to identify the real causes of the present discontents, and then we can talk about cures and roles and direction and purpose. I've read a book recently, I apologise for raising that, but and I've had a number of presentations. To start with, I had quite a task in sort of getting over to the audience that what we were trying to address, what was wrong. But actually, it's got easier and easier as the days have gone by, and really we only have to look at the newspapers to see the message that the world is on fire, that Britain's position is fluid and trying to re-establish itself in a completely, totally transformed international order. I mean, just to do newspaper stories a bit, the FT the other day, the distinguished Financial Times, announced that its editorial board had gathered together and reached the conclusion, wait for it, that the United States of America was no longer a reliable ally. Some will say, well, that was pretty obvious, but this was a great newspaper obviously agonizing and reaching this conclusion that the old story of the USA as number one ally and as long as we kept with them everything would be all right was now in question. But you don't have just to rely on that. I mean, the world is on fire. Every day you pick up a paper. I can't think, it's hard to find a capital in the world where there isn't protest on the street. Some of it's peaceful, some of it violent, some of it tragically leading to major deaths, and the list grows and grows. I was trying to think of, I mean, it's Paris today, which is in gridlock. It's Delhi the other day. It's Khartoum. It's Algiers. It's Hong Kong. It's Tehran. It's Baghdad. It's even in Moscow. There've been major street protests. It's very hard, Khartoum, and so on. It's very hard to think of capital, and we've even experienced a bit of it here. Some of it tragic, as we saw last week, but some of it much more peaceful. But anyway, the streets are taking over. The streets are empowered in a way that has never happened before, possibly in history. I don't know, some people say that 1848 may have been a bit like this, but there is no doubt that, as I say, to use that slightly emotive phrase, the world is on fire, and we do have to ask, not just say, well, that's it, anyone can analyse that, you can all read that for yourselves, but why? What I try to do in this book I've written is ask the why question. Why is there this splintering of opinion? Why is there an attack on the rules-based order between nations, which has kept everything reasonably together for the last 70 years, with exceptions, of course, in the Balkans, etc.? Why are we now, from the last 2 decades of the last century and the first 2 decades of this one, seeing the rise of Asia at such a fantastic rate, to the point where their living standards are challenging the West, where the whole confidence of the West is weakened, where China is emerging as a huge force in the world, with all roads leading to it in terms of economics and energy and so on. Why is there this tremendous breakdown of trust and respect in all hierarchies? It's not just Britain, it's everywhere. Why is there a sort of feeling of outrage and disappointment that people have been empowered, but somehow the power hasn't delivered? And the feeling that, in a way, Karl Marx would be amazed at the power that has now moved into the hands of the proletariat, the masses, us, people, everybody, but yet when the power is in the hands, not very satisfactory, very disappointing. Hence the outrage and fury that is all the flavour of opinion right across the world, and certainly in this country we're sitting in. And it leads brilliant men like a man I greatly admire, Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote a book called Homo Sapiens and another called Homo Deus, which many of you may have read. It leads him, and he's a very wise man, to conclude that really all the stories have vanished. The isms of the 20th century, the bad ones and the good ones, have gone. Liberalism itself has got so many paradoxes in it that it's under question. And he posits a world of sort of nihilism, which there isn't a story, there isn't a direction, there isn't a source of loyalty for anybody to gather around, which is rather frightening. And I think we have to be aware of that is the sort of mood that many people divine and guess is emerging amongst our populations, including the one here at home. So causes, I said we've got to look at the causes. What does the doctor say? Well, I'm going to be a bit of a doctor, and I'm going to be a bit of a nerd, and say really the root of it all, the root of the change of mood is the microchip, is the way in which the microchip came to be put, a computer came to be put on this tiny microchip about 40 years ago, and began a communications revolution of a kind and on a scale that has never happened in history before, and created the transparency, the awareness, and often the anger with the awareness that we see today. So the debating counterpoint is, well, there's always been protests, there's been the Chartists, there's been riots, there's been mobs through our history, there have been the French Revolution and so on, nothing new about that. But what is new is the empowerment, the power of the iPhone and the iPad and the communication system, which leads to according to the Financial Times, 5 quintillions of byte communication every day between every conceivable nation on Earth, the existence of 12 billion iPhones in the world, it's almost twice as many as there are people, 3.8 billion people are on the web every morning, 800 million in China alone. This is a totally new world of communication, and it is the paradoxes in that, the populism, I know that's a general phrase and it covers a whole range of grievances, and the feeling that really although it should have brought power to the people, it seems to have brought power to the algorithms and the high-tech companies who have the nerve to shape our lives and order us around and somehow encase us and cage us in ways that are very disappointing. So that is the story before us now. Those are, in my view, and I have obviously opened a challenge, the root causes. And are there answers for Britain, which is really the question of this evening? And I said, yes, there are. There, as has been rightly observed, they're internal. We've got to get our own health right internally, and they are international and external. We've got to reposition ourselves entirely in totally different ways to the pattern of the last 70 years. And those two propositions are around. They're not accepted at all by some quite powerful policymakers who cling to the past, but I believe they have to be. What do I mean by that? I mean, first of all, we've got to obviously make our democracy work. Everything is very poisoned these days by fake. The ability of people to say, if they see a fact, they can just simply deny it and say it's a fake, which doesn't strengthen democracy. The feeling that quality government isn't being delivered. I'm not trying to make party points either way, but a general feeling that things have become so complex and so argumentative that we are not delivering the sort of standards and quality government that people want, and the observation that the people who are good at getting elected aren't necessarily the people who are good at running a very complicated administrative society and meeting administrative needs. And that's why you get a sort of feeling that one politician saying they don't like experts, and the experts saying they don't like the politicians either, because neither side can sort of meet together and deliver. So we have to get all that right. We have to spread capitalism's benefits far more effectively. I've been writing books on this for 40 years. We have got to share the proceeds of digital capitalism. This was bad enough under the previous capitalism, but now we've got a system, a sort of warped capitalism, which concentrates benefits, which concentrates wealth, which concentrates income at a staggering degree, and furthermore, at a transparent degree. People can see it in a way that is thoroughly unhealthy and is bound to create domestic outrage and discomfort all around, and indeed does. We've got to face that this kingdom itself is being pulled apart by forces which we've got to learn to control, and the politicians are struggling to do that. I don't know where it's going to lead. None of us know where Scotland is headed, or Wales, or for that matter, Northern Ireland, for it hasn't got a government at all at the moment. But clearly there's a huge agenda coming up of constitutional reform. We have to face the simple fact that we've built our constitution around the assumption that Parliament is sovereign. But it's not. It's not sovereign. Sovereignty has been challenged, obviously, by the European Union membership of the last 40 years. It's now going to be challenged by vast devolution of powers to the regions and to the nations within the United Kingdom, and that is creating, and by the human rights laws which override those of Parliament. So we've got to rethink our constitutional structure, and that's a big task. So that's the internal health thing. Then internationally, the key insight is to realise that this is now a world of networks. It's not a world of Western dominance. It's not a world of hubs and spokes and the centrality of the West or of Europe or of Britain or of America. It is a world of networks, and we have to, in this country, if we want to survive, and we're a trading nation, we have to get in, recognise these new networks and engage with them and work with them and trade with them and contribute to them in a very, very vigorous way. I happen to believe that one of the biggest, well, in fact I know it's a fact, the biggest network of all actually is the Commonwealth, which is combined by united not so much at government level, all governments argue, but at people level. It is growing together at a fantastic pace of united language, common law, science, research, education, sport, technology of every kind, all levels of research and agricultural skills and so on. The networks are growing all the time, regardless of government. Networks have their own momentum. They don't sleep. They're netting together all the time, and I will give you later on, when I've got time, 101 examples of what is actually happening in the world, although it's not recognised by all those who should. It's certainly an opportunity for this country to radiate its soft power, which is enormous, transmitted right through the 2.4 billion people, of whom, incidentally, 1.3 billion are under 30, right across the planet. It is a huge transmission mechanism, but it's not the only network. If the UN is the unreliable ally, we have to look to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the RACP, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the new ASEAN, Compresa in Africa, Pacific Alliance, India, and we have to re-engage with Europe on a completely new basis, given that we've left the old EU, which to my mind anyway is a slightly out-of-date 20th century pre-digital organization that needs to pull its socks up. So that's where we can go. And it is a terrific story, but it needs articulating. It needs bringing home to people that we're not the center, the sort of superior center of some post-empire nonsense. We are just one country in a network. But as a country, we have got fantastic assets to contribute to show we can help the peace and prosperity of the world. But more than that, this is a crude and slightly right-wing tone, it's in our interest. That's where the markets are. Parag Khanna, who's a brilliant analyst of the, I'm a great admirer of his, I think he's at Harvard in Singapore, he writes a book called The Future is Asian, and he points out that over the next 11 years, consumer markets are going to grow by about $31 trillion. I'm sorry about these fantastic figures, but he says of that $31 trillion, 29 trillion is going to be in Asia, and the rest in the West. That's all it is, or in Asia and Africa. In other words, all the action, all the great growth of markets, and a lot of the technology is going to be in Asia. We have to engage in that area. Otherwise, if we sit and say, well, we're tucking under the European Union, we're tucking under America, we mustn't offend the Americans, otherwise they'll do us down again as they did at Suez. If we take that attitude, which I'm afraid is still largely the attitude of some of the senior reaches of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, we'll get left out. We will simply get left out. The new forces are enormous. They are changing the entire pattern of the world. We have to recognize what's behind it, and we have to respond to it. So if you say that's a bit much to chew off in a book or in 10 minutes, of course it is, but still, there we are. I have above my desk at home a very good reproduction, painted, of a Turner's picture, The Fighting Temeraire, which shows a steam tug towing this magnificent old sailing ship, 92-gun ship, which has had such a record at Trafalgar and everywhere else, to the breaker's yard. And of course it was voted Britain's most popular painting, because it showed the end of an era and the beginning of new technology, bringing with it fantastic social change, the rise of the socialisms and capitalisms and their quarrels of the 19th and 20th century, and all the politics that have followed from it, including the political parties we have today. So politics is the outcome of social change, and social change is enormous, and I think it is on a scale that's never happened before, and I think it's even reaching what John Stuart Mill called the inner consciousness. It's changing the way we get born, married and die, the way we behave, the way our children and grandchildren behave, the way that we eat, think, live and prosper. So that's my story for you, and I think the role for Britain needs articulating, and when it is, it will not bring us totally together, but give us a direction and purpose and a story as a nation in the 21st century, which at present we severely lack. Thank you.
Lord Howell, thank you very much. David Waring.
Oh. I wasn't expecting it to come to me so quickly. Well, I'm going to try and answer the question. You had a politician answering the question, so let's have someone not answering the question. I'm going to try and answer the question. I mean, my difficulty is that I'm not sure I share the priorities that underpin the question, and I'm not sure I like the way the question's framed either. But I'm going to try and address the themes. And bear with me, and you'll see how that unfolds. It won't be obvious right from the beginning. And the problem I want to address in British foreign policy, and how that, and I'm going to then trace how that relates to our collective sense of self and sense of others, and then we'll get into that national identity crisis question. The problem I want to foreground is what's happening in Yemen at the moment, where you have the world's worst humanitarian disaster, which is man-made, and all parties to the conflict are complicit in the creation of this man-made humanitarian disaster. But the leading culprit is an alliance of countries led by Saudi Arabia and until recently the UAE, and supported consistently for 4.5 years by us and the Americans and the French. And in that man-made humanitarian disaster, 10 million people on the brink of famine, and 85, this is according to Save the Children, 85,000 infant children have died of starvation and preventable disease as a result of a man-made humanitarian catastrophe created primarily by the Saudis with our help. I think that should provoke some kind of identity crisis and soul-searching in Britain. You'd think it would, wouldn't you? This is as a result primarily, and I don't want to excuse other parties of the conflict, the Houthis in particular have used siege tactics as well. But it's the Saudi-UAE coalition which is primarily responsible. They have imposed a blockade on the country. When you impose a blockade on an import-dependent and desperately poor country, you know full well what will happen. And what I've described is what happened, entirely predictable. UN experts reporting to the UN Security Council a few months ago described their deep concern, this is as far as they can go, let's be fair, their deep concern that starvation may be being used as a war tactic. Now I'm going to go a little bit further. I think it's blindingly obvious that starvation is being used as a war tactic by our allies, as I say, with our help. And in that UN report to the Security Council, the experts say that if this is indeed starvation being used as a war tactic, it is A, a war crime, and B, those states supporting the parties to the conflict, so the Iranians in the case of the Houthis, and the Americans, the French, and us in the case of the Saudis, would be complicit in and culpable legally in that war crime, the use of starvation as a war tactic. Now that should be unthinkable, shouldn't it, for us as a country, that we might be guilty, as far as I'm concerned we are, in the implementation of starvation as a war tactic leading to 85,000 infant deaths. That's not even the rest of the civilians and children over the age of 5. That's just the littlest of the little people, infant children. The leading cause of violent death in that conflict is indiscriminate bombing carried out by the Saudis, again, with our help. British jets, as a component of the Saudi Air Force, are no small part. They're a large part of the Saudi Air Force. And the indiscriminate nature of the Saudi bombing over 4.5 years, entirely consistent, year to year, same picture, indiscriminate bombing, hitting schools, hitting hospitals, hitting camps for internally displaced people, hitting residential homes, hitting civilian infrastructure, hitting clinics where they've been given the coordinates. Please don't hit our clinic, here are the coordinates. They hit it twice. They hit it once, they wait for the first responders to come, and then they hit it again. And these are, in all these attacks on civilian targets, a clear pattern documented by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Save the Children, Oxfam and the UN experts, reported for on-the-ground forensic detail of these reports. Consistent picture, I've looked at it from my book. It's a consistent picture, and these are, in no small part, British-made bombs, British-made missiles, dropped from British-made planes, flown by British-trained pilots, and, this is the crucial part, these planes are kept in the sky by ongoing British support. We sell them the jets, but we don't just sell them the jets. We provide for, in the big contracts that the Thatcher government signed, the Major government signed, and the Blair and Brown government signed as well. Remember the great humanitarian Gordon Brown? He signed one of these contracts, the latest one, under which we provide you with the planes, but we also provide you with the bombs, the missiles, the components, the spare parts, all technical and logistical support, including the maintenance, the deep maintenance that you need to keep those jets in the sky. Without that support, those jets don't fly. Within a week or two, half the Saudi Air Force gets grounded, and yet the British government for 4.5 years has provided that support and has sustained that campaign of what I can only see as state terrorism. Now, here's a question, if we're going to talk about a national identity crisis and who we are as a country. Why is it that the political class haven't talked about that at all in the middle of a general election campaign? And why is it that we've hardly heard about that at all for the last 4.5 years? Why is it that whenever I give this talk, I'm met with stunned faces? And it's not just stunned because the same feeling as me, how can human beings do this to each other? But it's also because through no fault of your own, a lot of you haven't heard this before. Now, why has your political class failed to inform you about this stuff? There's a problem here, isn't there? This is the media, politicians, and it's academics too. I'm not going to hold my own profession innocent. If you go to the British International Studies Association annual convention last summer, as I did, this is the big conference for those of us in British academia who study foreign policy. You have 6 panels in parallel at any one moment, 5 panels a day, 3 days. Guess how many panels on Yemen? 0. Guess how many panellists talking about Yemen? 0. That's British academia, the part of British academia that's paid very nicely to study our foreign relations. And they can't talk about Yemen. Genuinely pathetic. And of course it extends to the British media as well. Great journalists on the ground, but their editors don't give their reports the prominence they deserve. Opinion journalists have nothing to say about it, plenty to say about other people's atrocities, nothing about our own. And I think this should provoke an identity crisis, shouldn't it? A bit of soul searching. So what's going on here? Why are we not talking about it? I think there's 2 things going on. One, it's clear Yemeni lives don't matter. Yemeni lives are invisible. When we're talking about who's going to run the country, and we've got a choice between 2 governments who have very different policies on Yemen, we don't discuss it. Yemeni lives are invisible. That's a form of racism. Let's be quite clear about that. And it's a form of racism that we can't pin on one party or another. It's a form of racism that's right there, baked into our political culture. There's also a form of chauvinism going on, I would suggest, where apparently our intellectual and political culture isn't capable of computing and processing and talking about the fact, doesn't have the intellectual equipment to talk about the fact that we have a situation here where the British state is not the benign actor in the world, is not the great hero, or in the case of Iraq, the great hero that made a little mistake, but is a malign actor, just straightforwardly. Our intellectual class isn't capable of processing that, so it doesn't talk about it. Now, chauvinism, that's a case of chauvinism. Now, chauvinism and racism always go hand in hand. If you read Edward Said or Orientalism, that's a case of Western chauvinism working in juxtaposition and contradistinction with our sense of others, which is derogatory, derisory, and all the rest of it. There's an inferior other versus a superior us. And you can see that chauvinism, racism dynamic at play when you finally push these people in the political class, especially in my profession, in academia, to talk about this. What's going on? Why are we arming these people? And what I'll find from my more mainstream colleagues when I ask them this question is they'll say, yes, it's all very difficult, isn't it, arming the Saudis? I suppose what we're doing here is we're balancing British interests against British values. And that's the puzzle, isn't it? How do we do that? Now, put aside the misconception that arming Saudi and supporting Saudi is in our interests, deep misconception. You can read my book, buy it for Christmas, very sort of competitively priced, my book, and you can get into that question. Let me put that to one side for the moment. Think about that framing. We're balancing our interests with our values when we arm these mass murderers. Think about the racism inherent in the idea that there's a legitimate trade-off to be had between Yemeni infants and our national interests. Do these people get to live or die? Well, you know, what about our national interests? And I'm not trying to pin that on one part of the political spectrum. You hear that from the centre-left. When I get interviewed on talk radio by someone like Kevin Maguire, his big about Yemen, his preoccupation is not Yemeni lives, it's the British defence industry, as if that's more important than whether 85,000 Yemeni infants get to live or die. There's the racism inherent in that. There's the chauvinism inherent in centring our values in that equation rather than Yemeni lives. It's not our values at stake. It's really self-centred, isn't it? It's Yemeni lives that are at stake. And there's this impregnable conception of British values. British values are what we say they are, and it doesn't matter what the facts are, and it doesn't matter how we behave. British values are the values of enlightenment and human rights and democracy. It doesn't matter how many people we kill, it doesn't matter how many people, who we arm, it doesn't matter how many authoritarian regimes we back, or for how long we do it, or how deeply structured our support for these authoritarian regimes is. None of that is relevant, because British values are what we say they are. They're axiomatic, it's axiomatic, it's self-evident, they are what they say they are, irrespective of the facts. And let's look at those facts in a little bit more detail, just to get at this question of chauvinism within the British intellectual culture. Think about the long history of Britain's ties with the Gulf Arab monarchies. That relationship between these states, whose means of violence were provided by British power. Think about the relationship Britain has with Bahrain. Peaceful pro-democracy movement in 2011 rises up calling for democracy, violently crushed by the regime. What does the British state do? Provide more arms and deepen support for the regime. Same with Egypt after the coup. Military coup against the first elected government, they liquidate the opposition, kill over 1,000 people in broad daylight, Tiananmen Square style massacres, say Human Rights Watch. What does Britain do? Increase arms sales, and Theresa May congratulates President Sisi for winning an election with 97% of the vote. Well done, Sisi, a competitive politician. Think about the centrality of violence to British power historically, going right from empire up till now. These aren't aberrations, these are a central part of the picture. This is how we've related, or the British state has related to the world for a long time. And yet still, we talk about British values in the way that we do. So you can tell that this is dogma. This is not intellectual activity. This is a chauvinistic dogma at the heart of our intellectual culture. Now, how do we tie that into this question of vision and diversity? You might remember the Macpherson report that came out in 1998, was it? It was in response to the killing of a young lad about my age at the time, Stephen Lawrence. Was killed not far from where I grew up, stabbed to death by a group of racists. There was then a judge-led inquiry that found the police were institutionally racist, and they're dealing with that killing. And then, after that, there was a wider report by a commission on the future of multi-ethnic Britain. And the Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain looked at the state of race relations today, and looked at our collective sense of self in this country and our sense of Britishness, and said we've got two paths in front of us. The first path is that we can maintain the national sense of self, which is chauvinistic, which is exclusionary, and which is divisive. We can stick with that, and that's going to send us to all sorts of dark places. Or we can reimagine our national community, reimagine our collective sense of self as a pluralistic country, as a more open, tolerant country, and embrace our diversity. And partly we can do that through having an honest conversation about who we are and where we came from, including our imperial history. Now, you know what happened next. New Labour, the Tories and the press chose the first path. With their punitive approach to immigration, with their chauvinistic attitude towards Britishness, we ended up with an increase in racism, an increase in Islamophobia, we ended up with UKIP, we ended up with Brexit, and we ended up with Jo Cox being stabbed to death in the middle of a Brexit campaign characterised by racist demagoguery. But we can choose that second path still. It's always open to us. Second path where we challenge that chauvinism that's poisoned both our domestic and our foreign policy, where we shake off that imperial hangover and we embrace a different kind of Britain, one which is more plural, more diverse, a little more self-conscious, a little bit more modest, a little bit more historically self-aware, and a little bit more respectful of people around the world. The question, it seems to me, is what sort of country do we want to be? Is there a unifying answer to that? I'm not sure that there is at the moment, and I don't see why there necessarily should be. I embrace argumentation too. Let's have it out. Let's have that struggle. Let's have that argument. Let's have that fight. If we want to have a better country, we do have to fight for it, especially against the people in charge. Thank you.
David Waring, thank you very much. Sherelle Jacobs.
So going back to the question, is there a vision of Britain's national interest that we can unite behind? There is. At the moment, there is no vision. And speaking from a journalist perspective, that means that there's no story for us at the moment. It's deeply frustrating actually as a journalist, because it seems to me that the two big foreign policy stories in town are, isn't Trump awful and isn't Brexit awful? But I think that the problem that Britain has in terms of its foreign policy is it's muddled, it's lazy, it's unambitious, and at the moment that's a disaster in terms of where the world is going. I think that we are entering a very precarious juncture in the story of the world. I think that we're entering a new global dark age, frankly. We have, prior to this, been in a situation where we have one dominating superpower. I actually think that America is transitioning from a superpower to a merely significant power. I think that frontierism is seared into its psyche. You see that as far back as sort of the Wild Wild West, and you saw it in Iraq, but I think that they've overextended themselves, a bit like the Roman Empire. I think that its army is bankrupting them, and they are looking for a way to climb down, in the sense that they are looking to Europe, for example, to take on more responsibilities. And I think we saw some of the tensions this week in terms of the NATO conference. I think, meanwhile, we have China. I think the jury is still out about whether China is a stillborn superpower, or whether it really is the real deal. It's a debt-ridden, chronically overproducing factory haunted by ghost cities. It may well fold in on itself, but it may emerge as a real sort of contender. We are seeing Western countries, including our own, potentially becoming infrastructurally reliant on China. We saw that with the 5G network recently. They exert huge influence over Africa and Asia. We see that through the Belt and Road Initiative, locking countries potentially into crippling debt. Meanwhile, we also have Russia, so this unstable former superpower who is seeking to expand or to restore, depending on which way you look at it, territory such as the Crimea. And so we have to try and manage, or try and sort of figure out how we can navigate this very precarious global dark age. But I also want to stress that it's a time of huge opportunity as well, because the biotech and infotech revolutions, which we are on the brink of, mean that America is no longer necessarily the center of the world's ecosystem. China is already taking them on in everything from 5G to creating their own international commercial courts. I think with broadband, AI, robotics, there's huge opportunity for ourselves to place ourselves at the sort of central nervous system of the world as it transforms, as we are on the cusp of a new digital industrial revolution. My own view is that the EU has not really realised this. It's a brittle, divided bureaucratic organisation. Because of its size and its emphasis on consensus building, it means it's always looking for the low-hanging fruit. It's always looking for the lowest common denominator. Actually, we need to be nimble, we need to be proactive, we need to be focused about what's going on in the world in terms of the global volatility, but also how we can thrive. Just to go in a little bit, drill in a little bit more detail before my 10 minutes is up, I think that you've got to look at it in terms of solving problems, but also grabbing opportunities. I think there are two big problems that Britain, post-Brexit Britain, needs to focus on. I think one is Russia and the other is Iran. Because dealing with these two issues enables you to, in turn, try and deal with the China issue. My own view on Russia is that we need to try and bring them into NATO, or we need to scrap NATO altogether. I think Macron is right, NATO is brain dead. And we also need, because the reason we need to sort of bring Russia into NATO is because, frankly, a Russia-China alliance in 50 years or whatever will be a very dangerous thing. And so I think that it's very important actually for China to be aligned with the West. I think in terms of Iran, this is a huge issue, but I think that Britain needs to be there pushing the US to create a new JCPOA. And this time, rather than what happened with Obama in 2015, where we created this JCPOA and we just left it there instead of opening it up to just discussions to bring Tehran, draw Tehran further into the sort of world framework and not leaving it as an outlier. I think that we need to do it better this time. And these two things are very important because that in turn helps you to deal with the Middle East issue, because frankly, America and Britain need to get out of the Middle East. The only way you get out of the Middle East is if you deal with Russia, because the problem is as soon as you leave the Middle East, Russia is dominating the Middle East, and also you have the Iran issue as well. But you've got to deal with these two issues, and then it's kind of like putting all the parts into the puzzle. You can't really do one thing without the other. And everyone is desperate in foreign policy to not get bogged down with the Middle East stuff because they want to focus also on the Asia stuff. You've got to deal with the Middle East stuff in order to look and deal with the China issue properly. So there's all of the messy problem-solving things that Britain needs to think about going forward, and which Britain needs to lead on, because frankly, the US's position on a lot of these questions is chaotic. I think that it's a symptom of this transition, as I mentioned sort of in the opening, from a superpower to a significant power. I think there's a real visceral antipathy towards Donald Trump. I think in 50 years' time, actually, historians will be looking back at Donald Trump and thinking this is the moment of transition, really, when America stopped thinking about itself in terms of frontierism, in borderless infinity, and started thinking about its role in terms of limitations. And I think that the Mexican Wall debate, for example, I think that is a symptom of America now thinking of itself in terms of limitations. But in terms of creating opportunities, I think that Brexit, creates huge opportunities in terms of trade deals. I think there's a big trade deal to be done with China, a Swiss FTA-style deal. I think that there's a big deal to be done with America. I think the chlorinated chicken stuff, it's unfortunate because actually there's some much more interesting sort of aspects to the trade opportunities, not least fashion, also defence and drugs, and as these barriers get dismantled, there's huge opportunities there. And also in terms of emerging markets, I mean, the tragedy is that we are being outdone by the emerging markets in the emerging markets. I mean, there's really interesting case studies like a Mexican cinema chain that I was reading about the other day called Cineapolis, and how they've completely cornered the movie theatre market in Bollywood, India. So I mean, it's just all of these amazing opportunities which I think that we are letting pass us by because of our obsession with the EU. And two more things, I think that as multilateralism falters, I think there's more opportunities that Britain can lead on in terms of minilateralism. There's some really, really interesting things going on in Asia Pacific, specifically, lots of minilateral organisations which I think we can take inspiration from. And just to go back to something that I touched on previously, which is, I think, the most interesting potential story that no one's talking about, which is how we, Britain, make ourselves central to the tech ecosystem in time for the next digital industrial revolution. Everything from semiconductors, robotics, Manhattan-style project for biotech, Cold War style, high risk, high reward investment in nuclear energy. These are all things that we can lead on, and it will put us at the centre of this, very fluid network that is, that is developing. So I think that, it's a volatile time, it's a dangerous time, but it's also a time which is full of opportunities. I think we need optimism. I think we need focus. And I think going back to this question of how do we all come together, I mean, I'm very much of the opinion that you've got to lead, you've got to have some vision. I think my problem with consensus politics is that if you look forever for the lowest common denominator, you won't necessarily find it. But at least if you've got a story, perhaps you can bring people together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherelle Jacobs. So it seems there certainly isn't a single vision on the panel about what Britain's national interest and role in the world might be. Let's unpick it. I want to begin by taking the example of Yemen, because, Sophia, I think your research is quite interesting on the idea that David was talking about how people balance the idea of national interest and values. Tell us a little bit about that.
So overall, the country's quite divided on how we should balance our interests against our values. Essentially, around 40% of the country think we should have an equal balance of both. But Tory and Labour voters are quite polarised on this issue, so that skews, so we can't get a consensus position on it. Essentially, Conservative voters are much more interested in favouring economic and strategic interests over values, and Labour voters are much more likely to favour values alone. You can see this flowing into the manifestos this year in this election. We've got the Labour Party's manifesto is very much values driven, and actually very much about kind of minimising the idea that we could have allies of strategic interest who do not share our values. So that's quite a significant step change.
Closer perhaps to David's point of view in a sense.
Well, indeed. So interestingly, both the Labour and Liberal Democrat manifestos set out that both parties will immediately suspend all arms being sold to Saudi Arabia. Interestingly, Labour goes one further and says that they will also suspend all arms being sent to Israel. So you can start to see, I mean, what is really tremendous, really incredibly distinct about this election is the fact that each of these parties has an utterly unique foreign policy vision that's coming out. Certainly much more distinct and evolved and very much all of them kind of with their own type of radical vision, certainly much more than we've had in our modern history, where many aspects of our foreign policy have been conducted under a form of consensus.
Lord Howell, as somebody who's, I've sort of thought about politics and foreign policy for most of my career, and the sort of received wisdom is it's never of any interest at election time. But as Sophia points out, it's quite a big part of the manifestos, and we are talking about it more than ever. But when we come to this question of national interest and balancing values and national interest, is it possible to agree? I mean, it was Robin Cook who first talked about an ethical foreign policy. Yeah. But can we even agree on what that means? It would seem not.
I think it's very difficult. It's an eternal debate. Just on the Yemen issue, the report I chaired a committee which issued a report which came to the conclusion that the government was not on the right side of the law. It was on the wrong side of the law in its handling of weapons exports to Yemen, and that some of our weapons sold may have been directly involved and used by the UAE-Saudi alliance in committing atrocities in Sana'a and in Yemen. So there's my view. Where do I come from? I come originally, I suppose, from a Conservative party, which I've served in endless ministerial roles over 40 or 50 years. So I'm saying that just to bring home to you, it's you know, the parties are all more divided than ever. They are, after all, the big Labour Party is what, 150 years old, I suppose, little less than that. The Conservatives are running at 250 years old, the original Tories. They're conceptions and creations of a completely different age. Or even up to, I was just looking at a photograph the other day of the 1979 Thatcher cabinet, in which I had the honour to serve, and looking at all my colleagues around, not one of us carried a mobile telephone. We'd never even heard of mobile telephones. There weren't any computers or desktops in Downing Street. This was a pre-digital world. We had no conception of the fantastic growth of communication and the pressures and forces that went with it, which was going to lie ahead and screw up the capitalist system, lead to the Lehman crisis, lead to 9/11, and lead to all the things that have happened since. No conception at all. So the world has changed enormously, and the political parties, if you try and analyse, as the poor dear old, sorry, it's the BBC, anyway, the media have tried to do, try and analyse this election in terms of parties, you don't really get anywhere, which is why we're terribly uncertain about what's going to happen. And it doesn't divide up in this way that some commentators seem to imply, that on the whole the Conservatives are in favour of arms exports and Labour against. It's all nonsense. There are lots of internal problems which are very, very hard to reconcile. I think we did have a go with our report, and we did get the government to move several spots towards tighter control of exports.
I did quote
many
your
would
report
like to
at
see none
Dominic
at all.
Raab the other day, actually, when we had a foreign policy discussion, and Yemen came up. But David Waring, if I can bring you back in then, this question of values that you raised, we are also talking about, as you also mentioned, a pluralistic society, and doesn't that make it very difficult to agree on whose values, which values? Isn't that sort of underpinning our tensions over foreign policy?
I don't think so. And I really struggle with this idea that the thing we should be problematising is the British public, and that struggles over values are rooted in perhaps a diverse culture, people come from different places and have different values from us. Let's just focus on ourselves. This question about values, it's so...
But whose values? On this panel we might have different values, in this audience we might have different values.
Okay, let's examine the values that the British state and the British political elite claim to have: supporting democracy, supporting rule of law, human rights, etc., and this rules-based international order that the British political elite is convinced that Britain has upheld for all this time. Now, is that actually true? Are the values of the British political elite really committed to democracy? If you equip the world's most viciously authoritarian regimes with the means of violence, decade in, decade out, does that mean, are you still somehow committed to democracy just because you say you are? Maybe our real values, or maybe not our, I don't identify with the British political elite, maybe the British political elite's values have got nothing to do with democracy at all. Maybe they don't care about democracy. If you look at the evidence, if you look at their behaviour, it rather suggests that that's the case. So I don't see a British political elite balancing interests with values, because I don't see any evidence that they're sincerely committed to democracy, to human rights, to the rule of law, because I'm going not by what they say, but by what they do. The evidence, based on their behaviour, is that they're not committed to an international rules-based system. If you look at their behaviour in Yemen, if you look at their behaviour in this rules-based international system, I made a little list of the rules. So this is a classic example of political elites' sense of itself. We're committed to a rules-based international order. So let's think about some examples of the rules-based international order and how the British political elite has related to it. The invasion of Iraq. Straightforward war of aggression, violation of the rules-based international order. Yemen, facilitating war crimes, facilitating international humanitarian law violations, violating the International Arms Trade Treaty. Egypt, crime against humanity, liquidation of the Egyptian opposition. Britain increases its support for the regime that did that. More widely, international human rights law violated by all these regimes which we consistently support and help them to do it. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We pledged 50 years ago that we would work in good faith for complete nuclear disarmament. Did we do that? Nothing of the sort. Nobody, any of the other
Can I bring
countries.
you
by
in
the way.
briefly, and then I want
Well,
to open. I want
this
some
is,
time for questions.
this is powerful analysis, and it's very vivid, but we can go on analysing as to why it's happened, but we've got to get to the roots of the causes of this horrific story. Yemen's one horrific story. Why has Egypt ended up? It started with Hosni Mubarak. They got rid of him and thought democracy would flourish. It didn't. They've ended up with another military man. Why have these things gone so disastrously wrong? I think unless we are aware of the sort of empowerment of fragmented, incoherent popular opinion and the polarization it creates and the ill manners and the abuse and so on. Unless we're aware of these things, we're not going to have the kind of government that can control them.
All right.
And we are going to end up with a lot of anarchy.
I want to put one more question to Sherelle Jacobs, and then I want to open it up to the floor. Slightly different point. You talk about free trade agreements. One question that many people may be wondering is if you think about China and Hong Kong, an important partner potentially, but if a British government, any British government, is going to criticise human rights abuses in Hong Kong, could that be something that China puts on the table and says, in return for this free trade deal, actually you have to shut up about Hong Kong? Is that, again, this clash of values and trade in that case?
That's a very good
Yes,
point.
but I think that actually a lot of the attitude towards this question of pursuing interests versus pursuing values can be quite self-defeatist. I think on the China question specifically, China is testing the red lines and we are failing to pick up on that. I think that if Britain, European countries, America did put their foot down about human rights abuses, then China, who is frankly reliant on these countries in order to export all of the goods which it relies on, then I think that could be quite effective. But I think that I think the problem that foreign policy suffers from is, it's a cowardice and it's a self-defeatism, and that is not only bearing through with, the example you've just given, but it's also bearing out with sort of just the attitude to, pursuing Brexit and pursuing free trade deals. I think it's just this lack of drive, and I think that, with China, I don't necessarily think that those two things are mutually exclusive. I think you can do them both, but I think that you've got to have some real energy and some self-belief behind it.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Right, I'm going to open it up to the floor. I don't know if there's a mic, but you might just have, there's a couple of mics back there. So if you'd like to pose questions, I've got loads, but I'll guess gentleman there. Let's take a couple. Gentleman there and gentleman there. So if you go first. Man in the brown shirt.
Thank you. As a journalist who's worked in conflict zones, especially in Africa, I have a slight problem in the singling out of one particular conflict, whether it's Yemen or it could be any other, to advance a particular domestic political argument. Because, of course, you could use another conflict to advance a different kind of argument. It wouldn't get you anywhere. And if from the Yemeni example, you deduce that there's some kind of structural chauvinism and racism in British foreign policy. Of course, the same argument could be made to any country which sells arms anywhere in the world. The same could then be said for Russia and Syria, for the United States, in many countries, for France, for Europe. And when you get to that stage, the argument is no longer particularly useful. And so I wonder where this might lead. Because for me, the question that the Yemen example or any particular conflict example raises is whether Britain's global role can go beyond its own behavior towards influencing the behavior of others. Because, of course, if Britain stops selling arms to Saudi Arabia, that does not end the war in Yemen. That would be a kind of chauvinism to assume that because we do something else happens. So what does the panel see in terms of Britain's influence on other countries who are actors on the global level?
Thank you. And there was a gentleman in the brown shirt there.
I echo the previous commentators' kind of singling out of Yemen as singling out a very nebulous. It's cherry picking and low hanging fruit. I think Justin Oberter, the Supreme Court ruled that the BAE sales of arms to Saudi Arabia with the knowledge of the UK and the logistics supplied for the bombing of civilian targets might even constitute a war crime. And I think if you look at the SFO probe under Blair into BAE and sales to Saudi Arabia, that was dropped due to political tensions. So I also agree that, you can look at, for example, Iran. You have CIA, who backed the revolution that led to the installation of Ayatollah al-Khomeini. You have the Contras, who were paid with body bags filled with cocaine by the CIA for the war in Nicaragua. And you had the revolution in Peru. Anyway, so we have a long history of involvement and dirtying our fingers. But I would just like to add that with regard to where do we go in terms of foreign policy and our view as a nation and how we project that onto the wider stage and what is the link between the two. I would say that with regard to the Stephen Lawrence murder, if one recalls Sir Trevor Phillips, who was the head of the Human Rights Equality Commission, I think he was set up in the wake of the Stephen Lawrence killing, he basically said multiculturalism is dead and that what we need is integration. So when we have a leader like Boris Johnson who says that women who are in niqabs, they look like letterboxes. When we have this...
Do you have a question?
So the question is more if we live in a diverse polity, where we have diversity of opinion, diversity of views, but also that there is a kind of a democratization of opinion, where no one voice has transcendence over another. And we live in an age where basically God is dead. We don't live in a single,
Please, could you ask your question?
Society.
We're running out of time, and I think...
Okay, sorry, I just want to ask, where are we just going to be unable to pull our socks together collectively and think as one? And I think that there are barriers to doing so due to the multiplicity and diversity of the societies that we live in.
Thank you very much. Let's answer those two, and we'll try and get to a couple more.
Can I respond on Yemen?
Yes.
Yeah. This is what happens when you go to men when the questions come, isn't it? So
keep it fairly brief.
Why talk about Yemen? I'll tell you why we talk about Yemen as opposed to other conflicts. Because we in this theatre aren't floating above the world, separate from it, as innocents, detached and not implicated. We are sitting here in the British polity. And what we say and do has an effect on the behaviour of the British government. So rather than focus on all different kinds of conflict as though they're all the same and there's no differences, it's all nice and flat, we should focus on the things that we're complicit in. The British government is facilitating the leading killer in the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And to say, oh, it's all the same as everything else, is straightforwardly moral absenteeism. We should be paying attention as British citizens to our responsibility when this is going on. When our government's doing that, we should be holding it to account. That's straightforward moral responsibility. And by the way, someone, I won't go on too long, I'll just answer this one point. Someone raised it, and it's a popular misconception. If we didn't arm them, someone else would arm them. This is straightforwardly false. And anyone who's an expert in this will tell you the same. John Deverill, who was the defence attaché to Riyadh, who was interviewed on Radio 4 about a year ago when the Khashoggi thing was going on. At the same time as I was doing lots of interviews, said the same thing as I do. So if you don't want to hear it from some terrible lefty academic, you can take it from a man in uniform, much more respectable. He said the same thing. Those planes don't fly without our support, and it's a fundamental misconception of the military realities of that conflict to think that the Russians or the Chinese could just step in. These are complex weapon systems. When you sell them complex weapon systems, only you can help them maintain them. Russians or the Chinese can't provide bombs and missiles to be dropped out of tornado jets.
I'm keen that we get a couple more questions.
It's down to us, this killing. It's no one else. No one else is going to step in. We're implicated in it. So let's not muddy the waters or flatten the differences. It's important stuff.
Sophia, this idea that can we influence the behaviour of others and the difficulties of living in a very diverse kind of country?
Yeah, so I think, we've been in a position of huge structural advantage in the world for some time because we literally wrote the rules on so many aspects of global governance. This is one of the huge misconceptions around our role in the European Union. Rather than being some kind of, rule takers, always being bossed around and treated unfairly, we were very much the architects of a lot of its really core components. So we did exert a tremendous amount of influence in the EU. And, I think in terms of this rules-based world order, so much of that we've played a really strong role in. So I think there is a legacy of that, which actually means as well that we can continue to exert influence if we do want to take an active role in the world. But I do think that two areas that we could really particularly influence in and should influence in is one, defending global media freedoms. We're seeing a huge regression in media freedoms, even in places like the European Union. So we can absolutely champion that. And the other thing is that we're going to start to go through a huge conversation about internet governance. I think this kind of wild, wild west model of the internet and social media more generally there is a consensus even from the social media companies, even from people like, Tim Berners-Lee, that it hasn't worked entirely well. So we're going to have a new conversation about that. Britain, again, could be a really strong champion for a free and open internet, one that balances social harms better with also protecting civil liberties. And just finally, I think on this point about, whenever I do focus groups and we ask about really difficult questions, people always say, well, it's just, and I say, well, how should we determine this or that? And they say it's common sense. And, I think it is a really interesting question about what the center point of common sense becomes when you're living in very diverse, pluralistic societies. But I do think this is all down to leadership. It is up to our leaders. We actually empower them to articulate, define, and persuade us of a vision of citizenship based around common values. So if we are feeling that there is a lack of, if we're not feeling clear about what those values are, then that is a failure of leadership.
Sherelle? The extent to which Britain can influence the behaviour of others and the problems or the issues of living within a very diverse country, and how you can arrive at a single vision, a single view.
Okay, well, I think I've made my sort of opinion on consensus building clear. I think you've just got to lead. You're not going to please everyone, but at least you can, as you've also said, you are ensuring that the country is heading in a positive direction. In terms of this sort of balancing values with interests, I think the problem if you try and prioritise human rights over realpolitik is that nobody else is. You've got China trying to advance itself and its influence based on no strings, infrastructure, aid, investment. So if one person isn't doing it, then somebody else who's potentially more destructive is. I think that the best thing that we can do in terms of influencing others positively is to strive to prove that you can have the best of both worlds, that you can both have the trade deals, have the trade, and also make your red lines clear, so not being afraid to condemn China, for example, whether it's crackdown in Hong Kong. I think that's the best that I think that's the direction that we should be going in.
Okay, thank you. And Lord Howell.
Yes, just a bit of history. Cheryl's now writing articles in the Telegraph, which I did 45, 50 years ago. So you can be sure she's more up to date than I am, and very good too. A lot of these questions, what's our global role? How do we how do we define our values and uphold them more vigorously and not get involved in nasty, difficult international questions where we appear to be on the wrong? All these are very much questions of the world of chessboard international affairs, which used to exist, where nations manoeuvred as nations and tried to maintain spheres of influence, grab bits of territory, and it still goes on a bit. Obviously, the Russians want a longing, or Mr. Putin is longing to uphold the idea of restoring Soviet might by grabbing all the bits of the former Soviet empire back, of which Crimea is a good example. But in fact, we've moved on from the chessboard to the web. And the web is a quite different environment in which governmental relations assume lesser importance, although they're still significant. And the networks of interests and global interests and interests that lie almost outside the reach of nations, although, as has been rightly said, nations are trying to get some control of the high-tech companies and the algorithms again, not with great success at the moment, I have to say. The world is really operating on a completely different basis. The web brings power to the platforms which dominate the planet. This end of the planet we have the Yahoos, Amazons, the Instagrams, Facebooks, all the rest. The other end of the planet, they have the Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, and so on. We can try and control our Facebooks, our delivery of vile information, encouraging terrorism and so on, and racialism and so on. We can try and control our systems. Of course, all that will happen is that the Chinese will simply move in. They're already doing so, in fact. The Chinese already dominate 9 of the major ports of Europe. The Chinese are already dominating the British nuclear replacement operation. The Chinese are major owners of property in the City of London. The Chinese have major stakes in many of our utilities. The Chinese even own our football clubs. This is a force going on which we can preach to our governments and try and stick to our values as long as we like. But these things are going to go on happening. I promise you, the networks are moving, the forces are moving, which are outside the reach of governments. And unless governments are quite honest about the limitations of what they can do today, they're going to lead to a lot of dismay and outrage and fury as we proceed. So, I mean, the answer to all these questions is we've just got to be very agile in a completely fluid age. We can't even guarantee that we have long-term alliances. We've got to be on good terms with our neighbours in the European Union. It's a lovely place, Europe. I'm very pro-European. But that's just a small part of the story, a very small part of the story, about 11% of the world's GNP. I used to be a fanatical pro-European as a young man when Europe was 28% of the world's GNP. Then it was 25, then it was 20, then it was 17, then it was 15, and now it's 11 and shrinking. So the big play is elsewhere, and we've got to dodge and weave amidst all these immense difficulties, which have been rightly described. The Yemen is horrific. There's no question that it is horrific. There's no question that British arms, well, I think, or this is disputed, that British arms have played a bad part in it. Then we've got the agonising dilemma, which politicians have to face. Do you close down our exports of arms and let others play the game, as they will? How much can we just stand aside and say, we don't want anything to do with it, let some other people kill each other? What responsibilities have we got? What influence have we got? How do we build it up? These are the big questions you cannot dodge. And they're there, and they will continue to be there, and they're getting more intense every day. They will.
Now, we are out of time. I've well and truly crashed the points. There are a couple more questions there. Is it all right if I take them? Does anybody object wildly? No, because I did promise. Okay, so those two there, the lady there and the gentleman in the corner. And then we'll try and rattle through them, and I'll let everybody go. I apologise. We're in the news bulletin. I'm into the book at bedtime or something by now.
Okay, I'm from China, so my question is two questions related with China. So the first question is, do you think the Brexit will make prioritize its relationship with China? If so, more economically or politically? And what kind of implication does the Brexit have on the China-EU relationship? Can you give me just several settings in a summary, remark? And okay. The second question is that,
There's plenty there.
Okay. Just on the Yemeni conflict, Dr. Wearing, your analysis is very compelling and fluent. But given that the definition of chauvinism is excessive patriotism, and that the sales so far in the conflict from Britain are worth 4.7 billion, and yet we're saying nothing about it whatsoever, we're concealing it, doesn't that suggest that this is more about commerce than racism? And quickly to Lord Howell, what role do you see science and innovation playing in terms of the global role beyond Brexit? I lead on policy and comms for the leading research funder in the UK, and we do great work with China on antimicrobial resistance. We do great work in low and middle income countries, in Ebola and a range of conditions. And Brexit is a direct hindrance to our ability to function as a science superpower, actually, that we are, because it stems the flow of European talent into the country, and it stops us from being able to link up with European research programs. And we're actually a net winner out of Horizon 2020. We put 5 billion in and took 7 billion back.
Thank you very much. You're right.
Lord
Howell, do you want to...
I'm sorry, I just got off an aeroplane and I'm not hearing as well as I
No,
should.
that's...
Give me the gist of those very interesting questions.
Well, the gist of that final question, which I think was directed at you, is the extent to which how Brexit affects science and becomes a hindrance to the flow of ideas and indeed the flow of talent and people. Is that something that concerns you?
Yes, it does. It concerns me a lot. That I mean, Brexit is a minor part of the bigger scene we're discussing, which is the enormous involvement of the public in all its different coherent forms in the great constitutional and national strategic issues, and putting the huge issue of in or out of the European Union to a referendum wasn't a terribly good idea, because it's all sorts of complexities which have emerged since, which many people feel weren't properly aired at the time. So yes, it does worry me. It's accelerated, I think, what was already there, the immense bitterness and polarisation, and feeling there isn't any sort of middle ground. I actually, on the Europe issue, I'm in the middle ground. I'm not going to bore you with it, but usually when you put it, you immediately get shot down by someone who says either you're an intolerable Europhile, narrow understanding of this, or the other side, oh, you're an intolerable Brexiteer, you don't understand the glories of Europe and being involved with your neighbours in a proper federalising arrangement. So it's very hard to argue the middle ground. It does concern me a great deal, and I think we have to try and get on top of these enormous divisions. I think, I don't want to get into election politics, we're all supposed to be in Perdar, but if we can, move one is to get the withdrawal agreement, which has been tried 3 times, with infinite patience, I may say, from Brussels. People denounce the European as intolerable and so on. They've modified their deal 3 times with Mrs May and once with Boris, and I think it's perfectly possible that when we negotiate they will again, but it's all right, sorry, you want me to shut up?
Only because we're fantastically over time, so I'm very conscious.
The answer is yes, I am worried. I think it can be overcome. I think there is a future ahead which we can have as a sort of one nation conservative or social democratic Labour influence again. At the moment we've got neither, and that is very worrying.
Sherelle, if you want to address specifically that question of how Brexit might impact on relations with China.
Yeah, China, okay. I think that at the moment our trade with China is relatively small. I think it's very imbalanced in China's favour. I think that Brexit is a huge opportunity to try and rectify that. I think that we should be trying to pursue a sort of an FTA deal on the Swiss model. I think that, from a selfish British perspective, I think that we should be trying to improve our investment access in terms of specific areas in which we are more competitive, so financial services. And I think I'm fairly confident that Dom Raab and Liz Truss and the Conservative government sort of understand that, and I think that is what we will see if the Tories do win this election next week.
Would you like to intervene? You don't have to.
Brexit and China, I mean,
My guess
you know,
is 25 majority.
Sorry, side conversations here. Look, the conversations we're having, you know, Brexit is compelling us to think about our relationships in the world. It's also coinciding with the dawning consciousness that some of those relationships will be more challenging than others. And obviously, moving away from an EU-centric approach also means moving away from an approach where we were quite comfortable, in a way, having our largest trading partner being a partner who did share our values. And we are going to come up against the challenges that many other countries in the world have been facing long before us, in having to balance, again, our interests and our values. So I think there is a dawning consciousness, particularly about China and its rise and some of the security risks that it potentially poses to Britain. We are very far behind many other countries. We've got a lot to learn from places like Australia on this. So I think that it's going to be a very challenging time for us to balance this sort of buccaneering idea of a free and global Britain, while at the same time also realizing that, you know, there will be a lot of really difficult conversations ahead. And so I think that, yes, Brexit, well, I think there will be opportunities, but they will also be matched, if not exceeded, by the challenges.
And David, briefly then, the question of, is Yemen driven by commerce rather than racism?
I've been very verbose, I know, I'll try and be very, very brief. So when I talk about racism and chauvinism in regard to Yemen and Britain's role there, I'm talking about how we talk about it, rather than what the underlying interest is. I'm trying to make sense of the absence in the national conversation of Yemen, and when we do talk about it, the particular ways we conceive of our role there, and that sense of self-satisfaction and these people not mattering. With regard to the interests, it looks like commerce, because like you say, £4.4 billion worth of arms sales, but actually when you look at it, and this is all in my book, very reasonably priced, great Christmas present, actually, even in the peak year of British arms sales in recent years, 2015, when the Saudis ran out of bombs, so they needed us to replenish them, when we sold £3.3 billion worth of arms in a year, even then, all exports to Saudi, military and non-military, and there's a lot of non-military exports, all of them added up to just 1.7% of British total exports worldwide. So they're not half as important commercially as you think they are. The values to the British military industry, we sell them those arms to maintain our arms industry so we can carry on being a global military power. The commercial value is not that high. It's just the strategic value that matters. It's all in the book, very reasonably priced, great Christmas present. So.
I think you've been taking lessons from Boris there. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. If I was to do this on air, I think I'd have been sacked long ago. So thank you for staying over, but it was good to get some questions in. Thank you very much to our panel, David Waring, Sophia Gaston, Sherelle Jacobs and Lord Howell. Thank you for listening and taking part.